Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had an encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. Tonight's first guest is Mike. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hey Vic, how you doing?
I'm doing good, and you?
Oh, doing pretty good.
Good. Well, thanks so much for being here. Mike, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, I'm 32 years old and I live in the Central Valley of California. I've spent most of my life as a painter and a handyman. Love playing cards. Love getting into the outdoors. I've spent a lot of my younger life living in the mountains of California. And yeah, that's about it.
Well, that sounds like a good life to me. Before you had your encounter, what were your thoughts on the possibility creatures like Dogman could exist?
Well, before my encounter, I've heard of like Bigfoot and werewolves and different stuff. I found some books when I was pretty young of some cryptids like Loch Ness and Bigfoot. It did intrigue me, but I'm one of the people that I have to see it to believe it. And so until I see it with my own eyes, you could tell me all day till you're red in the face and I might not believe it, but when I see it with my own eyes, then I kind of have to be a believer.
Well, that doesn't make you any different from most people. Seeing is believing after all. Your encounter happened 20 years ago and you haven't told anyone about it until now. Why did you decide to come forward with your story now?
Well, it's always been in the back of my mind and been kind of troubling because, when you see something you can't explain, you don't just want to run off and tell everybody because most people will think you're crazy or laugh at you. But since listening to your show and other shows like it, it's kind of opened my eyes to remembering that experience and kind of reliving it and thinking, well, maybe I should come forward with this evidence that I have, and if I might be able to get some answers and help anybody else out that might have had an experience as well. So I just felt like it was time, and I know I listened to your show, and I hear you always, in the beginning of it, you're always telling us if you have an encounter, where to go, and so I'm like, that's where I should go.
Well, I'm glad you did decide to come forward and get this out in the public view. Being an eyewitness like you are, and listening to the show for as long as you've listened to it, do you find it comforting or disturbing to find out that there are so many other Dogman eyewitnesses out there?
A little of both, but I think I might find a little more comfort in it, knowing that other people have had encounters and that everybody from every walk of life, it seems like, could have an encounter. So, a little bit of comfort hearing that I'm not the only one.
Yeah, you're definitely far from the only one. For every person here on the show, just think about how many people just suffer in silence and you'll never hear about their encounters, so yeah, you're part of a pretty large fraternity. All right, Mike, please tell us about your encounter. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
All righty. Well, I think it was about 1998, and it was just after Halloween, I believe, near the end of October, beginning of September. And I remember clearly it was a nice brisk day, and it was, I want to say, 6:30 to 7 o'clock in the morning. And I was getting up for school. I lived just outside of Mariposa, California by a few miles down the 140, headed toward Yosemite National Park. And, it's pretty high up. We got snow during the winter. But this morning there was no snow. It hadn't snowed yet. But it was still that part of the morning where the sun hasn't quite come over the hills. So it's light outside, but there's no sunlight. So it's kind of not dark, but just before the sun comes out, and it was kind of cool. And that morning I set out for the bus. Most mornings I'd be headed to the bus. I'd go with my younger brother, but this morning I believed he had asthma trouble or a doctor's appointment, but for some reason he wasn't with me, probably for the better. So I headed out on I think it was about a half mile down a dirt road to the main road where I caught the school bus. And so about halfway in between that walk was a pond. I'd come off the top of our hill and kind of wind down, and it led out right near this pond, which is, I want to say, roughly about the size of a football field, give or take a few yards. And it was the best pond ever. We had just summers of fun there, fishing and swimming and never any trouble. And so, then as soon as I'd get to the pond, it would be a right turn and then a nice little hill up and then the rest of that dirt road to the main road. And so this morning I set out and I get down to that pond and something grabs my attention as I get to the pond and turn toward the main road. And I look across just in time to see, because on around the front side of the pond, on our side of it, it was all flat and pretty even. But the back side had a nice hill that went down into a gully. And I want to say it was about a 20 or 30 foot hill that come from a gully and went up and then come down to the edge of the pond. The other back side of it had a nice little hill or berm on it. And anyway, so as I get down to the pond and look across to where that hill is, I see a very large, hair-covered, I couldn't explain what it is. It was just so massive, and it crept down on all fours toward the edge of the pond. And the one thing I really noticed about it at first was the size of its neck and head. I mean, it was just bigger than any bear I had ever seen. It was bigger than anything. But another thing I noticed was the sheer size and mass of the shoulders, like a linebacker or somebody who worked out, like just odd, like I'm thinking, is this somebody in a suit? Is it a pig or a hog, giant hog? Because another detail I just remembered too is its ears. I remember it had real shaggy fur around the massive neck sitting on these just gigantic shoulders and two ears that almost looked floppy, like a pig or a hog's ears, but way bigger. And the mane on this, it had like real shaggy fur right around where the head was. As I'm thinking of it and trying to come up with a sketch, I think I remember seeing its tongue lapping up water, kind of like a dog's. But it had its face down toward the edge of the water. And so I'm sitting there looking at this thing kind of in disbelief, like, what is this? I've never seen anything like this, and I've seen bear, I've seen pig, there's lots of deer, there's even mountain lion, and nothing I could think of was coming up to mind. But the thought that was going through my mind is that my younger brother might be coming down the hill after me. He might be a little late to get into the bus. And so fear ran through me and I'm thinking, what do I do? Do I go back up and tell him? Do I go? And then also another option I had was near the main road, not too far from the pond, was a stack of rocks, pretty big boulders. And we would climb on them as kids. And so I was thinking, maybe I can get up there. It was about 12 feet off the ground, but a pretty dangerous climb, and thinking, I might be able to hide up there. But for some reason, and it all happened pretty quickly, but for some reason I got this calm that came over me, and just something told me, Mike, you got to move before this thing sees you. And that's what I did. Without hesitation, I moved toward the main road and didn't think twice. I was scared for my brother, but luckily, as the day went on and I came home, he ended up going to the hospital or having a doctor's appointment, so he wasn't on that road alone. But luckily, I think the thing hadn't seen me, so it didn't lift its head, didn't get any clear eyes or mouth front facial features. But I did get the massive head, the big ears. And as I think back too, it kind of comes back to me that it may have been moving an ear, almost like if a deer or a dog hears something and one ear will move. I'm pretty sure that one of the ears might have flicked or moved. And that was about when the thought came to me, if this thing sees you, it could probably make it around that pond in no time and be upon you. But that's about most of the encounter. The past few days I've been working up, talking to you, it's kind of come back and give me a little bit of anxiety.
Oh, I'm sure it hasn't been easy. You said its ears were floppy looking. Have you heard about any other Dogman reports that involved a Dogman with floppy ears?
I'm not sure. I've listened to a few of them, but I know that that's one thing that kind of stuck out to me, that they were so big. And I think that's why I came back to thinking it might be a boar, because I've seen boars with floppy ears or pigs with floppy ears. They have almost a canine looking ear, a nice pointy ear, but it can be kind of floppy. And I remember thinking that it might have been a pig because I thought maybe there was like a pig farm or something around there, and I even went and looked. I think afterwards, not that day, but at some point being around it, I kind of looked down the backside of that hill. Because before then, we really didn't go to that side of the pond. I mean, we had been by it, but, you know, it was on the kind of the opposite side of our property. Oh, and then another thing I did remember was there was a house fairly close to the pond, and the lady who lived there, at one point she came down and was just irate. And this was, I think, after I had my encounter, but my brother and I were there at the pond, and she came down just hysterical, like, you don't need to be in that pond, you need to get away from it, what are you doing? You could get sick. But the way, you know, she was so upset, it kind of seemed like there was another reason she might not have wanted us around that pond or around the property.
Wow, yeah, that sure does make you wonder if she did know something about what was going on. How far did you say that home that she lived in was from that pond?
I want to say it was, so there were two hills, like, let's say like the west side and the south side of the pond didn't have any hill on it, but the north side and the east side did, and she lived on the east side, which is a pretty good hill up to where her house was, and her house kind of overlooked the pond. I want to say maybe just 100 yards or so from the pond her house was, but I think she could see it.
So you think she could see it when this was all going on that morning?
Yeah, or I mean, I think she could see the pond, to say, not necessarily what I saw, but you know, she might have.
I see. Yeah, she just might have known something if she was that close to the pond.
Another thought I had too was when we first moved up there, you know, it was kind of like living there was one of the like highest points in California, the highest in elevation, you know, that we had lived, and it was pretty good and deep in the woods and lots of wildlife. And going from living in the city or in the valley, you know, to like a city, there's all kinds of noises at night. Fire trucks and ambulances and police cars and car alarms and stuff. And you'd think you'd move to the mountains in that deep that it would be peaceful and quiet. But boy, at nighttime, the hills come alive. The sound that would come out. I think I told you, but another thing that happened there was one night we woke up to all this like really horrible screaming. And it was like, you know, just like things were getting eaten. And even a lady screaming. And it was just very strange. And then we find out that that lady who had that house that overlooked the pond actually had dogs tied up outside. And while she was gone, she said it was a bear, but who knows? But she came back to find all her dogs eaten and gone, and her chicken coop destroyed and flipped down a hill. And this was the same lady who came up to us and was like, you don't need to be by this pond, and you need to get out of here now.
No wonder she responded that way. Yeah, she definitely knew about it then, I'd say.
That's what I was thinking, because when she came down, it was just like, she was just so upset. And it wasn't, you know, not necessarily to us. It wasn't like a you're trespassing thing. It was like, hey, you're in danger here.
Well, that's admirable of her to look out for you that way. Thank goodness, huh?
Now that I think about it, you know, I was upset as a kid, like trying to run us off our favorite fishing spot. But then I come back to think, oh, and you know what? A thought just came to me too. The funniest thing. So that pond we fished in, right? Scout's honor. I only caught one fish out of it, and it was a nice sized big mouth bass. And on its side, it had a claw mark that went from one end to the other. And I swear up and down, and I can get my brother to contest to that fish that I caught. I thought that, you know, it was a bear that went for it, and maybe that was a scar. A nice scar on the side of this fish. I don't know if I had this picture of the scar on it, but I remember I took the one picture of the one fish I caught at the pond.
Yeah, sounds like it would have been a trophy since fishing was so hard there. And to find a claw mark even on that bass, sounds like that Dogman or whatever that creature was, sounds like it got around.
And that year, too, I remember fires. There were many fires in lots of areas, so I wonder if maybe that might have brought it up or got it out.
Yeah, it might have, but it's hard to say. When you say its ears were floppy, please give us more details on how they looked. Is there a dog breed you could compare them to?
Probably, if any dog breed, I think I might have to go with a German Shepherd. because I've owned a German Shepherd, and the ears on it were about the same. But the way it flopped and kind of turned at the top, I swear it was like one of them was floppy or moving or listening, and the other one was pretty straight up and down. But yeah, I would probably say the German Shepherd.
When all this was going on, did you notice a lack of ambient noise?
Yes, yeah, I did. It was deadly silent. It was just quiet. I think it was the reason I could hear myself think and say, hey, you need to get down the road before this thing sees you. And I also always question that because, I was taught growing up in the mountains that if you come across a wild animal, you never run. I mean, if it's a bear, that might be a different circumstances, but usually most times they tell you if it's a mountain lion or something, you act bigger and you stand your ground. But for some reason I had this thought that, hey, you need to get down the road.
Well, you know what they say, Mike, everyone's got a plan until they get hit, or until they see a Dogman. Before you had that encounter, had anything ever happened that led you to believe that some unusual creature might have been in that area?
Well, me and my brother had come down one day we were walking to school, same little path, and on the side of the road we come across a deer that was a full-grown doe, and she was pretty good size, with no apparent injuries, but was passed out. And to me, it seemed like exhaustion or shock. Like her eyes were just big, and she was panting just very slowly, like her borderline about to die. And we even got a neighbor who had the gun to come down, our mom at the time, talked to him. And he's like, oh no, that thing's dead. Someone probably hit it with a car and then went back home. But it didn't look like it got hit by a car. And I've seen deer on the road that have been hit, and there's blood or there's something you can tell, but there was nothing wrong with her beside her just laying there dead from shock or passed out from shock or exhaustion right on the side of the road. And where she was kind of in a little ditch or a gully that went under the road and fed into the pond, because I think it was a snow runoff pond, if I remember correctly. We did have a nice game trail down at the edge of our property that every morning a herd of deer would come through. I mean, you could hear them and see them through the trees. It was pretty neat. But so I know that, there was deer in the area, and there was a nice game trail that was used daily.
Well, that only makes sense. Wherever you find dogmen, normally you will find a pretty healthy population of deer. Even though it's been 20 years since you had that encounter, do you still think about it a lot?
Yeah, I do think about it from time to time. I know since hearing your show, I've kind of, I never really put anything to it. I just figured maybe it was a mutant. I don't know. I never had an explanation for it. And then listening to your show, it's kind of come back to me and I remembered it. But yeah, over the years, it's come up a couple times because since then I've become pretty interested in cryptids and Bigfoot and things that go bump in the night, and been kind of curious and, always wanting to find out and know more when I hear something like that. And another thing I do is when I meet someone new, I'll ask them, it's kind of funny, but I'll ask them, do you have any ghost stories, or do you have any UFO stories, or how about Bigfoot? Most people laugh at me, ha ha ha. I've never had a Bigfoot encounter. I've had, other paranormal encounters, never any UFO or alien, but I'm a believer of people. And that's one reason I like your show is because, I believe people on the personal level. And when they're given an eyewitness account and you can hear in their voice the sincerity, the fear, that's what I think my attraction to the whole cryptid thing is that there's some pretty believable stories out there. And you can hear how shaken people are. One story that really got me into cryptids and stuff was from a guy who was a mentor of mine, and he actually was my employer for a long time and a very honest man. I never had a bad dealing with him. I've never known him to lie or tell anything, but he told me a story that he was told by, the story he heard was from a mutual friend from another friend. He wasn't surprised at that because this guy who actually had the story happen to him was so honest that he wouldn't tell anybody. But one of his really close friends, on a night of drinking, he let loose with it because, again, like these stories, you can't really tell anybody. They think you're crazy. But the story's pretty short. He was on a trail clearing crew in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I think it was like the 60s or 70s, and they had to actually hike up to where their camp was, and they were camped in front of they said it was about a 6-foot boulder, and a Sasquatch come over the top of it and screamed at him, and somebody had a pistol and shot it in the air. It didn't care. It finished screaming, turned around, and left, and they said they packed up that night and got off the hill. Kind of fuzzy on it, but he told me that, and he said the guy who it was about was a very honest man, that he would not lie. So that's kind of where I got my start. And after hearing that, I'm like, well, that's pretty neat, and I believe this guy, and if he's telling me, I find a little truth in that. And so that kind of started me on my quest to find truth and ask people, because like I said, I believe people.
Well, I'm sure that left the impression on that guy, understandably so, too. Did you feel guilt about not sharing what happened to you with your brother because of the danger it might have put him in?
Yeah, I think I did feel a little guilt, but at the same time, I think maybe the guilt came later, because at first it was more like putting it in the back of my mind and filing it, way back so I never have to think about it or deal with it again, and not to scare people, because I'm sure it would have got a couple people in an uproar, thinking that there's some giant beast out there waiting for us.
Though I'm sure it would have gotten more than a couple of people in an uproar. How big did it seem to be?
Well, gauging it, from that side of the pond, I want to say that if it were to stand up on its hind feet, it'd be peaking 12, 13 feet, maybe more, because the size of its head, again, its shoulders and its head and just the neck part, like, it looked like it had something on its shoulders. The head was so big. And I was just thinking, like, what, this just doesn't add up. Something with, it kind of almost has the hair and the fur of a bear, but is on all fours like a cow or a boar or something, but it's got the head of just something else, and ears like a dog or a pig, and just sitting there lapping up water. And the way I remember distinctly the way it creeped down from the hill to the water. And that was very eerie. It all four kind of crawling low to the ground. But yeah, still brings me shivers and chills when I think about it.
Though I think it would give anyone shivers to think about an experience like that. If you think it would have been that tall on 2 legs, how tall was it down on all 4s?
On all 4s, it was at least clearing about 5 feet or plus, like with its shoulders when it was, it did get pretty low at times, but I could tell, when it got down to the water's edge and it kind of was in that push-up position, it was pretty good size. The neck and the shoulders on this thing. It was bigger than any bear I had seen ever. At least up there, in California.
Yeah, that is awfully big. I know you said it was down in that crouching position, so it might have been hard to notice details in its leg structure, but I still need to ask to be thorough anyway. Did you have the ability to see what type of leg structure it had, hominid versus canine style?
It looked more hominid for the arms and the legs. I couldn't really see the hind legs too well, but just the sheer size of its kind of back, because it was I think I kind of had just a slight side profile, like it wasn't straight directly, at the pond. It was kind of to the side drinking at a little, I think there was a couple little kind of calm spots on the side, or just like a little kind of alcove deal on that side of the pond where it turned. So he might have been out on like a bar or a sandbar, a little mud bar drinking, kind of at an angle. So I was able to kind of see his shoulders, his kind of side a bit, but remembering the back hind legs, it was kind of fuzzy. But again, it all happened real quick, and the adrenaline was pumping, and it was it was intense.
Oh, I'm sure it was. You talked about how the ears were floppy, but you didn't mention where they were positioned on its head. Where were they positioned?
Pretty high, like the back pretty high. So, and that's what was surprising to me, because it had this just massive bodybuilder shoulders, and then this head, it was like that's why I'm saying 13 feet, because it looked like 3 feet, the neck and the head, like it was just so massive. But then it had like kind of a longer face going into the water, drinking, and the ears were kind of at the very top of that coming off.
When you say it had a longer face, do you mean it had a muzzle?
Kind of like a muzzle, I couldn't, on the face part, I couldn't make out much detail besides seeing the tongue a couple times, which as I thought back to it and trying to come up with a sketch for you, I come up with thinking about that I saw the tongue, and I didn't get much detail on the muzzle, if it had a muzzle, but it did have a very long face from where like the forehead would be down to the mouth. It was quite big. It was just huge. I just couldn't wrap my head around how big it was.
Well, no one can fault you for not noticing whether it definitely had a muzzle or not. You definitely had more important things on your mind, most notably not having a Charmin moment.
Yeah, and not being lunch for this thing or breakfast.
Oh, yeah, I'd say. Not good. How much trouble did you have after having that encounter, doing the things you needed to do in day-to-day life?
Not too much trouble, but again, doing anything around that pond or the backside of that pond, I pretty much didn't do any more fishing on the other side of that pond, especially not alone. I didn't even like going down there. I had another thought that came up to me too, is that we had a pit bull, a lab, and a German shepherd at that property. Every morning almost they'd run down, most mornings at least, they would run down and get in that pond. And so I'm kind of curious, has there been any encounters where like dogs are friendly with the Dogman or aren't bothered by it, I wonder? Because they seem to be pretty comfortable around that pond.
Well, there have been instances where dogs didn't seem to really react to a Dogman's presence, but I don't know of any situations where a Dogman's been around and dogs seem to like it. Most of the time when people talk about a Dogman being present when dogs are too, the dogs aren't happy. They're either apoplectic or they're terrified.
Yeah, because one of the dogs was pretty terrified. Like she had a real problem with, she was just, a very fearful dog and very submissive. And I think she might have been abused. I'm not sure on that, but we had never put our hands on her. We loved her to no end, but she still was very skittish around the property and when people would come up on her.
Were there any other strange experiences on that piece of land?
There was another lady who lived kind of on the other side of the property, more near the main road, but she had livestock, I think goats and sheep and stuff, and maybe chickens. And she had multiple encounters with, I think, bears trying to get in, but she also had where her animals were killed. She had lost goats and chickens. And I think just kind of chalked it up or, explained it with it being a bear, which in that area, I don't know if I believe that.
Yeah, it's funny how bears seem to take the blame for these Dogman encounters all too often. Before you go, Mike, do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
No, I think that's about it. I appreciate you letting me come on and share my story, and, if it helps anybody out, I'll be grateful. And I appreciate you doing the show, Vic. You're doing a great job, and we all love listening to you.
Well, thanks so much for your time coming on the show, and thanks for the good words. I appreciate it. Tonight's second guest is Ahkee. Ahkee, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Vic, for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. Ahkee, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, okay. My name is Ahkee. I'm from the Syracuse area. I've been cooking for a restaurant. I have a family, and I do stories for a passion.
When you were small, did your mom tell you that monsters weren't real, even though she had had a Dogman encounter of her own before you were born?
My mother never told me that monsters didn't exist. If anything, she told me the opposite. My mom always told me that there's things out there that we can't explain. I'm sure her incident impacted those thoughts.
Well, I'm glad she was honest with you about that. How did that impact you when you're hearing your mom telling you that monsters actually were real?
I believed her. And then it wasn't too long after I had my incidents and seen things in the city that tell me that this world is very strange.
Yeah, it sure is. There's no denying that. From what you've told me in the pre-interview, your mom's been telling you about that encounter she had almost your whole life. How old were you when she started telling you about that?
When she first told me her story, I was 8 years old, and she had sat me and some friends that were staying the night over. We were watching movies or whatever at the time, and she sat me and my friend down, and she explained what happened to her and her friend.
When she's sitting there telling you about this story without telling us any of the details of her encounter, what are you thinking? I mean, after all, this is your mom telling you this story.
Like I said in the previous interview, I took it as just a story that had happened to her. You know, I was really young, so I didn't really know what to think of it. But 4 years later, after I had my experience, I looked at the whole situation differently. And when she told me her incident, I could see that it had affected her. She can't sleep in a house by herself. She can't go into the woods. She's petrified of the woods. But for some reason, she's fascinated with Dogman and Werewolf. And I think she was so afraid that she became fascinated with it.
Well, that would make sense. Whenever you're terrified of something like that, it is human nature to try and find out as much about that subject as you can. So I'm glad she's doing that. In a way, I'm sure it's helping her to deal with that experience.
I think that's a way that she copes with it, is watching the movies that she watched and just talking about it when the time happened.
Since you said she's so into the Dogman topic, is your mom how you found out about my show, or did you find out about it on your own?
Oh, I found out about your show on my own, Vic. One night I was just going through YouTube. I seen your YouTube channel and I clicked onto it, and it gripped me. And I told my mom, I said, Mom, you got to listen to these interviews. A lot of these people has had a similar situation to you. So she listened and she became fascinated with your show herself, and she just wants me to tell you thank you for doing what you do and that you saved her mentally by listening to these interviews. So I just want to thank you for that, Vic.
You're welcome, and please make sure she knows that she's welcome too. If at any time she'd like to talk about that experience she had, of course she doesn't have to come on the show. If she wants to come on as a guest and tell us about that experience, that's fine. We can definitely set that up, but I'm more than happy to talk with her about that experience and help her any way that I can.
We appreciate it.
You're more than welcome. What can you tell us about the place where your mom's encounter happened, Ahkee?
Okay, so the place that this happened at is in the Syracuse area. It's towards the east side, and that's a big variety of where it could be at. I don't want to give the specific location. But this place used to be somewhat of a morgue before it turned into the building for just women. And how it's built is it's like a camp area, the best way I can explain it, and it has housing units around a halfway circle street. From the side of this, there's a building in the back where the women lived. And then on the side of the building, there's a hill where the park was, and this is where the incident happened.
Let's go ahead and talk about that experience now. Please give us every last detail that comes to mind.
Okay, so this is what's been told to me pretty much all my life. It was the year of 1987. My mom and her friend, we'll call her Sam, had been living in this building just for women. They were in her room, and it was around 9:30 at night, and it had been in the fall month. And I believe it was a couple weeks before Halloween, actually. So my mom's friend asked her if she wanted to go to the park because they didn't want to go out that night. It was like a Friday night. The doors were going to lock soon. So they just decided to go to this park. So my mom had agreed. So the two of them proceeded to go to the park. They walked up the hill. And how this park looks is basically it has swing sets. It has a little play area. Then there's a ladder that goes up to a patio that you can stand over and look over the area, and it's connected to a slide. So this is where they were hanging out at. They were sitting there and they were talking, and then just out of nowhere, my mom explained to me that she heard a horrible howling growl coming from the forest area outside the field where the park was. So the two of them looked at each other and they asked each other if they heard it, and they agreed. Within a few moments, again, it repeated itself, but this time it was closer. So this time they became really, really afraid. They became statues is how my mom explained it. They just felt like there was something around them and they could not leave. They did not want to move. So another few moments later, they heard it again, but this time they had heard it underneath the area that they were sitting. And it had scared my mom's friend so bad that she had urinated herself. What she explained to me is that she could see the wet outlining of the pants and it going down her legs. So my mom tried to coach her friend that, we have to get out of here. There's something around us. We need to get back to the building. And her friend became unresponsive. So knowing that my mom, who she is, she's like, I have to get out of this situation. So she took it upon herself to get up, and she began to climb down the bars. And as she was climbing down the bars, this is what she told me, Vic, She seen in front of her, underneath the patio area in the space, two, not red eyes, not green eyes, but two yellow eyes looking at her, and it scared her so bad that she let go of the bar. She dropped down to the ground. She was screaming for her friend that she needed to get out of there, so she got up on her feet and she proceeded to run. And the story goes that she got about 40 feet away and she looked behind her. So she seen her friend running now. So her friend must have snapped out of the shock position that she was in and proceeded to run along with my mom. And my mom said when she looked back and she was 40 feet up ahead, she seen the creature just standing behind her friend as her friend was running, just letting them get a head start. And then it made a gesture as if it was going to chase them. So she didn't continue to look back anymore. What she wanted to do was she wanted to keep running, and she didn't go to the main entrance because she figured by then the building had been locked. So the girls knew that the back door would always be open because they would sneak people in, they would sneak people out, they did whatever they did at that time. So they pretty much just knew that the basement door would be open. So my mom proceeded to run. At the angle that she was running, she seen that the door was crept open, and she made it inside. Meanwhile, her friend is still running out in the field, and she could hear her friend screaming, "It's going to get me, it's going to get me." So finally, it must have took forever. Her friend had arrived. She got her friend inside the building. They shut the door. They locked it. She explained to me that they sat, they cried together. Eventually, they had to separate, and my mom did tell me that night she did hear a howl. They never told anybody around the area, and when I got older, I was the first one she ever told. And that's pretty much how that story goes.
How descriptive did your mom get describing what she saw that night?
She told me that she couldn't lie and make up facts. This is what she seen. She seen two yellow eyes staring at her, and she seen a brown type of furry outline standing. It was standing on 2 feet. She wanted to make that clear, that it was standing on 2 feet. She didn't say anything about how the leg shapes were. I know a lot of people report that the legs look funny, but she didn't give me any type of description like that.
I can only imagine what they must have gone through back then. At its closest, I'm a little fuzzy on how close it got to your mom's friend. It sounds like it got closer to your mom's friend than it ever got to her.
Well, I believe she's the one that suffered from it from the most. My mom says she wasn't right after that. And I did get to meet this woman, and she did confirm that this happened. Yeah, they've suffered from it for years. My mom still talks about it to this day.
Oh, I'm sure she does. I'm sure she thinks about it all the time, unfortunately. But going through something like that, it will tend to have that sort of effect on you. You said your mom is still suffering through after effects from that encounter, but do you know if nightmares are one of the after effects?
Oh, she definitely has nightmares. Like I said, she can't go into the woods. She's petrified of the woods. She can't be in houses by herself. She's not a person who likes to be alone.
Well, that's understandable, like I said, after an experience like that. When your mom saw those yellow eyes as she was climbing down, do you know how close the Dogman was to her at that point?
Oh, it must have been only a few feet away from her. And the reason why I say that, Vic, is because I've actually played on this playground. I've actually been to this area and seen this area for myself. I would be lying if I said I didn't live 10 minutes away from it. I try to remain away from there because of the stories that I've heard, but I've seen the park myself.
Right now, are there a lot of woods around that park, or is it all built up around it?
Oh, it's still the same. It's very, very dark at night. You would think that it wouldn't be, being that it's in a city, but that doesn't mean anything. Once it gets to be around 3, 4 o'clock around here, it's very dark here in Syracuse. If I may, Vic, I just want to mention that there is an Indian reservation around here. It's pretty big. It's around Syracuse, outlining, and I've been there, and it's terrifying there. They stay in their area, and Syracuse stays in their area, and the only reason why people go to the reservation is to get cigarettes.
How close is that res?
Oh, it's 5 minutes south side of Syracuse. If that, it's really connected if you want to know.
Well, that is close. Does your mom realize that Dogman let her and her friend get away that night?
I think she does after she has listened to your episodes. I think she was confused how they got away. If it wanted to get them, it really could have got them. But obviously it let them escape. And I think she realizes how lucky she was to escape. These things are real, Vic. People say they want to go out and they want to find these things, and some people think it's a joke, but it's not. When you physically see this thing or you physically hear this thing, it's real.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're definitely real, and the experiences, too. Did you notice any changes in the way your mom would deliver that story over the years, possibly indicating that as time went by, she was actually having an easier time talking about that experience?
Her story never really changed, maybe like little things when she would talk about it, but that's what made it real to me, is that her story never changed the whole time that she's been telling me this her whole life, my whole life. She's always been the same. She can't be alone.
Well, I hope things have gotten at least a little easier for her as she's related that story more and more times. That's normally how it is, but I guess there is no guarantee that's how it's always going to be.
I believe, Vic, once you have a Dogman encounter, you never fully recover. You never look at life the same again. You never look at the woods the same again. Your life has completely changed in a way.
No, I agree. I definitely agree. Life never will be the same once you have an experience like that, but it is possible to eventually get to the point where you can function the way you need to function and do the things you need to do in a healthy way. You had a strange experience of your own from what I understand. What happened to you?
So this is how my story goes. When I was 14, I was with my friend and we were on our way to his girlfriend's birthday party. And this happened in a trailer park area because I used to live in a trailer park when I was a kid. And there was a lot of forestry and a lot of water and lake around there. So we proceeded to go around, I don't know, I'd say around 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. We decided to leave outside the trailer park and cut behind this plaza area. So as we were walking, to the right of us was the forest. And just as we got halfway, we heard the howl. And it scared us. We stopped dead in our tracks. And we asked each other, hey, did you hear that? And we said, yeah, we heard that. So we took off running. And by the time that we made it to the public area, we had heard a scream, like a woman screaming from the woods. And I never understood that until I got to listen to your show and realized that that's what they do. And that's how I know it was a Dogman. I don't understand why a woman would be in the middle of the woods screaming along with a howl. It just doesn't make sense to me. I know that was a Dogman.
How close did the source of that sound seem to be from you?
I would say maybe about 60 feet away. Yeah, it definitely had us in its eyesight. I'll say that.
Yeah, that's close.
Later that night, I had to walk home by myself, and I had lived in a trailer park in the back, so I had to walk all that distance going home, and I had never been so afraid of it in my life. Walking, knowing that I had heard that thing, and knowing that nobody was around. If like something wanted to get me at that time, there was nothing I could have done. I was only a 14-year-old kid. I mean, even now as a grown man, there would be nothing I could do.
From what you told me another time, you and your girlfriend found something in a field. What did you find?
Well, that was from a previous girlfriend. We used to stay with her parents out in a country field, and one day we were on our way to a friend's house, and when we were arriving back, we would cut through this field, and in the middle of the field was only one footprint, and it was huge. It was like a bear footprint. And I never understood why there was only one. If I would have had a camera phone at the time, I would have. But by then, phones were just getting popular for cameras.
Yeah, back then, I guess you didn't have the ability to take a cast of that print, did you?
Oh, I didn't, Vic. Not at the time. I remember it, though. I do.
I'll bet you do. Well, it's about time for us to get out of here, Ahkee. Before we do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
I just want to say, from us down in the audience, that we appreciate what you do, Vic. We look forward to your episodes. I just want to say thank you for having me come on this show. I just want to thank my mom for letting me tell her story to you. It's not a joke. These things are real. Whether if it's spiritual or if they're an animal, it doesn't matter. The point is you could be driving down the street one night, see one of these things come by you and change your whole perception on how life is. And that's just the reality of it, whether if you want to believe it or not.
Well, thanks again so much for your time, Ahkee. Have a great night.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.